This set of mini lectures concerns the work of John Macmurray, and specifically his Gifford lectures, presented under the title of The Form of the Personal and published as The Self as Agent and Persons in Relation. In the Gifford lectures, Macmurray systematically explores every aspect of human experience. The journey leads him to uncovering a completely novel form of logic. My primary aim in this lecture series is to explain and decode Macmurray's logic. But at the same time, I want to show that his logic is more than some kind of dry philosophical theorizing. It has profound significance for our ability to understand what it is to be human. But let's start by exploring John Macmurray in context. Who was he? And what were his foundational ideas? Macmurray was brought up in a very religious family. He even had aspirations of becoming a missionary, but the First World War put an end to that. When he returned, he completely rejected the Christianity that he was brought up with. But he remained convinced there was wisdom in Jesus' teaching. Most of his life, he was a university lecturer, professor at London and Edinburgh. In the 1930s, he gained some notoriety for being the first academic philosopher ever to broadcast on the radio and even got peak audiences. He wrote some 15 books, many pamphlets, and The Form of the Personal, his Gifford lectures, he delivered towards the end of his career, the complete lectures not being published until he was in his 70s. Towards the end of his life, he became a Quaker and he died in 1976. Macmurray, writing in the mid-20th century, did not fit into any particular school of philosophy. From Kant, he inherited his passionate concern for conceptual clarity. He shared with Marx his recognition that philosophy is not just about interpreting the world, the point is to change it. Meaningful thought is for the sake of action. He was also in tune with the themes of the existentialists, the vulnerability of human existence, our potential for fear, anguish and shame, as well as for courage, compassion and love. Of the existentialist philosophers, he shared perhaps most with the relational philosophy of Martin Buber. He also took a keen interest in the nascent psychoanalytic theory of his time and was particularly influenced by the thought of his Scottish contemporary Ian Sooty, a critique of Freud, and one of the first in his fields to assert the grounding significance of personal relationship. Although Macmurray decisively rejected institutional Christianity, he very much retained a religious sensibility rooted in his radical reframing of the teaching of Jesus. And this did not win him friends within the fiercely atheist philosophical community in Britain at that time. Macmurray believed that the development of philosophy had hit a brick wall, and the problem was primarily a conceptual one. We didn't know how to provide a conceptual understanding of the nature of being human. Macmurray concluded that in order to solve the thorny conceptual problems which philosophy faced, he would need to start from first principles and question the grounding assumptions of the philosophical tradition. Macmurray notes that the tradition of philosophy is biased towards the perspective of the thinker, the isolated ego looking out with curiosity at the world about it, And this leads to a view of the world which is individualistic, theoretical, and egocentric. The bias is so ingrained we hardly notice it. But Macmurray insists that we do not exist primarily as thinkers, as disembodied egos. We're not primarily observers of the world, but participants in it. It is our capacity both for relationality and embodied practical engagement that makes us fully human. We express our humanity through our capacity to find meaning in that which is outside of ourselves, not by being egocentric, but by being heterocentric. So we see that Macmurray wants to change the focus of our attention from the isolated self to persons in relation and as the agent in dynamic relation with the world. Macmurray concludes that until we make this shift in standpoint, this change in perspective, philosophy will remain stymied. So the change in perspective is the first step. The next step is to try to solve the conceptual problems which arise from attempting to think from this new standpoint. This is a problem that Macmurray seeks to solve. Though Macmurray wrote about the full range of human experiencing, in this lecture series, our focus is on his logic and also on relationship and action. And when I say logic, I don't mean procedural logic, I mean the logic of representation. How do we accurately model the world in reflection to allow us to think about it? According to Macmurray, Enlightenment philosophers had attempted to understand the world through the analogy of material reality. The metaphor of a clock was commonly used, and it was, of course, during this era that the foundations of science were laid. By the 19th century, the clock metaphor had been replaced by an organic one. Increasingly, philosophers saw the world as one in a process of development, of growth, and that this happens through a series of alternating phases. Perhaps the most developed conceptualization of this was Hegel's dialectic logic. Now, Macmurray argued that neither the material nor the organic integrating principles are adequate for understanding human experiencing, the world we experience as persons, which is characterized by intentionality and relationality. Macmurray sometimes referred to this as the crisis of the personal. Macmurray hypothesized that since everyday experience of being human is not random and chaotic, it has a coherence to it, there must be an equally coherent logical pattern implicit in it. He calls it the form of the personal. The form of the personal is Macmurray's attempt to solve this logical conceptual problem. He comes up with a completely new form of logic. In its bare bones, it states the positive contains and is constituted by its own negation. In this mini lecture series, my aim is to decode Macmurray's thinking and so make it accessible. Why does it need decoding? Well, Macmurray uses the very abstract and formal language of philosophy, and this can be quite impenetrable, even I might add to seasoned philosophers. But not only this, his logic is novel. It requires a paradigm shift. We must step out of our habitual ways of thinking in order to appreciate it. And finally, it's incomplete. It's frustrating because there are evident gaps and apparent inconsistencies in his thinking. The problem is that though Macmurray describes very clearly the underlying logical principles and applies it systematically to each area of human experiencing, he doesn't show us how all the pieces fit together. Certainly the outline's there, some of the pieces are in place, but it doesn't complete the picture. So in this set of lectures, as well as decoding the form of the personal, I seek to complete it, to show how in Macmurray's thinking there is an underlying coherent system of thought. I start off by first critiquing the mechanistic or material worldview based on the principle that positive and negative are equal and opposite. Next, we explore the holistic or organic worldview in which positive and negative are considered to be complementary in a process of development. And then we start the step-by-step exploration of the form of the personal, a form of logic in which the positive contains and is constituted by its own negation. In order to make Macmurray's thinking accessible, I use metaphor as well as a whole range of visual imagery. I also develop a visual notation. Now, one of the problems is that as soon as we start to scratch the surface of Macmurray's logical system, we find complexity. Now, it's not really surprising. If you think about mathematics as a logical system, we might start with thinking about whole numbers, and then we go down in steps until we find complex imaginary numbers. Now, the same applies to the form of the personal. I use metaphor to help take us down through a series of steps in complexity until we reach what I call the integrated model. Think of a donut. A donut necessarily includes something which is not donut. The positive, the stuff of the donut, includes something which is not stuff. This is the essential idea of an asymmetric polarity. The positive contains and is constituted by its own negation. So in everyday experience, we know the world as stuff. We meet it practically by picking it up, tripping over it, falling over, making stuff. But in order to do this, we must also know it as idea. In other words, as not stuff. That's the paradox that the form of the personal holds. And we'll explore this aspect of it in the first set of lectures, part 1. In the second set of lectures, we explore the form of the person in the context of relationality, or more simply, friendship. The paradoxical nature of friendship is expressed poetically by Khalil Gibran. He says, "Let there be spaces in your togetherness. Sing and dance together and be joyous, but let each of one of you be alone, even as the strings of a lute are alone, though they quiver with the same music." This is the essence, the paradox that the form, the personal, seeks to capture. I want to finish by saying that because I'm trying to simplify quite a complex and nuanced philosophical argument, I will to a certain extent inevitably end up with something of a caricature. Also to say that although I use quite quirky, light-hearted language sometimes, this is also a serious philosophical endeavour with intention of making a contribution to understanding Macmurray.